Welcome to the Relationships Decoding Podcast.
Ever get that feeling like you're missing something in your relationships, like trying to figure out what makes them tick and just wishing there was a shortcut to understanding it all? I think we all do, right?
Yeah, totally. It's a natural thing, wanting to understand those dynamics, figure out the push and pull. We all crave those aha moments, those insights that make everything clearer.
Absolutely. And who wants to wade through tons of complicated theories just to figure out their own relationships? Not me.
Yeah.
So that's exactly what we're tackling today. We're doing a deep dive into this thing called PUA.
All right. PUA, short for pickup artist. You might be surprised to know that the term itself isn't actually new. It goes back to the 1970s.
Oh, really? I had no idea.
Yeah. Back then, it wasn't the negative term it is now. It referred to a group of people who were genuinely fascinated by the science of attraction. They were, dedicated to studying it, almost like an art form.
So it was more about, understanding how to connect with people, like the art of meeting someone new.
Exactly. They wanted to master those initial interactions, how to spark interest. You could say they were trying to become experts in flirting and social skills. Kind of an innocent vibe, really.
Yeah, it sounds almost wholesome in that original sense. But PUA definitely doesn't have that same positive feel today, does it?
No, not at all. The meaning's shifted completely. It's become associated with some pretty dark stuff. We're talking manipulation, psychological bullying, and a lot of straight-up deception, especially in the online world.
It's like that original interest in social dynamics took a wrong turn somewhere and became all about using those insights to control and exploit people.
You hit the nail on the head, and that's precisely why we felt it was important to dive into this. We want to give you the tools to recognize these manipulative patterns, understand how they work, and how they can be harmful.
It's like equipping ourselves with a radar for these toxic behaviors. So let's get into it. What are some of the classic moves in this, let's call it, less than ideal PUA playbook?
Okay, so one of the most common tactics is something called negging.
Negging. What's that exactly?
It basically involves delivering these subtle insults or criticisms, often disguised as playful teasing. The goal isn't to actually provide helpful feedback, it's to chip away at the other person's self-esteem.
Oh, so like backhanded compliments or those jokes that kind of sting a little.
Right, and it plays on our natural desire for approval. By subtly undermining someone's confidence, the manipulator positions themselves as a source of validation, making the target more likely to seek their approval.
I see. So it's not just about the negative comment itself, but the deeper goal of making someone feel less secure so they crave that attention.
Exactly. It's creating a need that they can then fill.
That's messed up. What about that whole demonstrating higher value thing? What does DHV look like in practice?
DHV is all about showing off. The person will actively try to showcase their status, wealth, talents, anything they think will make them seem super desirable and impressive.
So it's like creating this shiny facade to draw people in.
Exactly.
Wow. Okay, and then there's emotional manipulation, which I think is a big one.
Absolutely. Emotional manipulation in this context is the deliberate use of someone's vulnerabilities to control them. The manipulator figures out what makes a person tick their insecurities, past hurts, anything they can exploit to make them feel guilty, obligated, or dependent.
So they're basically using that sensitive information as leverage to get what they want.
Right, and it often involves phrases that trigger those feelings, like saying, if you truly cared about me, you would do this. Or playing the victim to make the other person feel sorry for them.
It's like they're pushing all the right buttons to manipulate the person's emotions and get power over them. And it can be so subtle at first that you might not even realize it's happening until you're feeling really insecure and second-guessing yourself all the time.
Yeah, and by that point, you might already be deeply invested in the relationship.
What about rapid escalation? How does that work?
Rapid escalation is about creating a false sense of intense intimacy very quickly. They might shower someone with excessive affection early on, share really personal information too soon, or push for a deeper level of commitment before things feel natural.
It's like they're rushing the relationship so the other person doesn't have time to think clearly or see the red flags. It's that classic whirlwind romance that sweeps you off your feet.
Exactly. And it can be very disorienting for the person on the receiving end.
Okay, so it's no surprise that these kinds of tactics have earned PUA a lot of negative attention. I mean, it's pretty clear why people are so concerned about this stuff.
You're right. It's inherently manipulative and disrespectful. If we zoom out a bit, these methods prioritize getting a specific outcome, usually a romantic or sexual one, above genuine connection or respect for the other person.
And it often involves viewing people, particularly women, as targets or objects to be conquered, rather than individuals with their own thoughts and feelings.
Yes, and that's a huge problem. The focus shifts from building a healthy relationship to achieving a specific goal through manipulation, which completely undermines the possibility of real intimacy and connection.
It's like the opposite of how most of us want to build relationships.
Right. It's based on deception and control rather than mutual respect and understanding. No wonder PUA has been so heavily criticized.
Let's talk about how these tactics actually play out in real life. Can we get into some concrete examples to help people see how this might show up in their own lives?
Sure, let's break it down. Imagine an intimate relationship where one person constantly tells their partner, "You're not good looking or not capable, only I would accept you." That's a classic example of emotional manipulation.
That's so awful. What makes that statement so damaging?
It directly targets the person's self-esteem and creates a sense of dependency. The implied message is, you should be grateful for my attention because you wouldn't find it anywhere else.
It's making someone feel completely unlovable, so they become dependent on the very person who's putting them down. What about in a workplace setting? How might PUA tactics show up there?
Think of a boss who constantly and publicly criticizes their employees, not in a constructive way, but in a manner that just chips away at their confidence.
Yeah, it's like they're trying to keep their employees feeling insecure and small so they don't challenge their authority.
Exactly. It's about maintaining power and control by making others doubt themselves.
It's workplace bullying disguised as leadership.
Mm-hmm.
What about those pig butchering scams we hear about online? Those seem like a particularly scary example of PUA in action.
You're right. Pig butchering scams demonstrate just how sophisticated these tactics can become. It usually starts with the scammer presenting this image of success and wealth online to gain trust and interest. They want to appear incredibly successful and desirable.
Right, like they're living the dream life.
Exactly. And then comes the vulnerability play. They share fabricated stories of hardship, like being betrayed by a business partner or family troubles, to evoke sympathy and build an emotional connection with the victim.
So they create this false sense of intimacy and trust.
Yeah. And finally, they'll invent some urgent financial need or use guilt to pressure the victim into sending them money.
Wow. It's incredibly cruel. They build this whole elaborate facade and fake a deep connection just to exploit someone for financial gain. So with all these tactics out there, how can our listeners start to recognize PUA behavior in their own lives?
It's important to remember not to jump to conclusions based on a single instance, but being aware of these patterns is the first step.
So we shouldn't overreact to every little comment or action, but it's important to pay attention to those recurring behaviors that feel designed to manipulate us or make us feel bad about ourselves.
Right. And remember, it's not always these huge dramatic gestures. Sometimes it's the subtle things we say in our everyday interactions.
Like those offhand remarks that could chip away at someone's confidence over time.
Exactly. The source gives a couple of good examples, saying things like, "What you're doing is wrong," without any explanation, or offering backhanded compliments like, "You finally didn't mess up this time," can be really harmful.
It's almost like those comments are designed to make the other person feel constantly on edge, like they can never do anything right.
Yeah, and it creates this dynamic where one person feels superior and the other feels inadequate.
The source recommends focusing on specific facts and behaviors rather than making vague personal criticisms.
Exactly. It's about addressing the issue, not attacking the person. And it fosters more open and respectful communication.
Thinking about the early stages of a relationship, the source mentions how manipulators often use specific tactics to hook someone in.
Right. It often starts with creating this almost impossibly perfect experience. Lots of attention, affection, expressing unconditional care, basically showering the person with everything they might crave in a relationship.
So it's like they're building this foundation of intense, positive emotions to make the person feel incredibly safe and happy.
Exactly. Which in turn can lower their defenses and make them less likely to see the warning signs.
Because they're so caught up in this whirlwind of good feelings.
Precisely. Then, once they've got the person hooked, they start introducing those more subtle manipulation tactics, slowly chipping away at their self-worth and making them more dependent.
It's a pretty insidious strategy, and that leads us to some of the specific red flags that the source highlights. Let's start with isolation. What should people be looking out for?
Isolation is a major one. The manipulator's goal is to cut you off from your support network, your friends and family, so they can become your primary source of everything: validation, support, advice.
It's about making you solely reliant on them.
Exactly. They might start interfering with your social plans, always wanting you to spend time with them instead of others, or they might even try to plant seeds of doubt about your loved ones, making you question their trustworthiness or intentions.
So if you notice your social circle shrinking, if your relationships with your family and close friends start to weaken after this person enters your life, that's a big red flag.
Absolutely, because when you lose those connections, you become more vulnerable to the manipulator's influence. They become your only source of validation and support. Another common tactic is implanting rules.
Implanting rules. That sounds a bit intense.
It is. It's all about controlling the small details of your daily life under the guise of looking out for you.
Like what?
It could be anything from dictating what you eat and when you sleep to controlling what you wear, what you watch, even who you're allowed to interact with. The message they're sending is, if you don't follow my rules, you don't really love or respect me.
So it's about creating this framework of control where your obedience becomes a measure of your worth in the relationship.
Exactly. And over time, you might internalize those rules and start to believe that their way is the only right way, which further erodes your sense of self.
Then there's surveillance. I think a lot of people associate that with like extreme cases, but the source makes it clear that it can happen in more subtle ways in everyday relationships.
Absolutely. It's about violating your privacy and creating this atmosphere of constant scrutiny and distrust. It can be anything from constantly checking your phone and social media to contacting your friends or colleagues to monitor your whereabouts.
So it creates this feeling of being watched all the time, never having any privacy or freedom to just be yourself.
Right. It's incredibly suffocating. And then there's belittling, which can be especially damaging because it often hides behind humor or even a pretense of honesty.
Belittling.
It's about making you feel inadequate and insecure. They might deny your strengths, exaggerate your weaknesses, or even publicly humiliate you under the guise of joking.
So those seemingly harmless digs or backhanded compliments can actually be part of a larger pattern of emotional abuse.
You got it. It's all about chipping away at your self-esteem so you become more dependent on their approval.
The last thing the source talks about is abuse. And I think it's important to recognize that it can take many forms, not just physical violence.
You're right. Physical abuse is definitely a form of forced submission, and it's crucial to recognize the early warning signs.
What are some of those signs?
It might start with seemingly minor acts of aggression, like pushing, shoving, grabbing things that might not leave visible injuries, but are meant to intimidate and establish control. It's that unspoken threat, that sense of physical dominance that can be really scary.
It's like they're testing the boundaries and seeing how much they can get away with.
And the source makes a really important point. If you become desensitized to those initial acts of aggression, it can escalate to more severe forms of violence.
It's a slippery slope.
Yeah.
And it's important to remember that abuse can also be emotional and psychological, which can be just as damaging as physical violence.
Exactly. No form of abuse is acceptable. The source ends by saying that noticing one or two of these signs in isolation doesn't necessarily mean someone is using PUA tactics, but it's definitely a reason to proceed with caution.
It's about recognizing patterns of behavior, not overreacting to every little thing.
Right. And then they ask this really powerful question. Have you found yourself feeling more confident and self-assured or more insecure and unsure of yourself since being with this person?
That's a great question to ask ourselves, isn't it?
Huh?
Because a healthy relationship should make you feel good about yourself, not tear you down.
Exactly. You should feel supported and empowered, not constantly second-guessing yourself or walking on eggshells. If you're feeling increasingly insecure and unhappy, that's a major sign that something's wrong.
And it might not be you. It could be the other person's behavior.
Right. That's why the source asks this really critical question. Is it genuinely about your own inadequacy, or have you encountered someone who is simply not good for you?
That's such an important distinction, because often the manipulator wants you to believe that any problems in the relationship are your fault, when in reality, it's their behavior that's causing the issues.
Absolutely. And recognizing that and being willing to step away from people who exhibit these harmful PUA traits is crucial for protecting your well-being.
So to sum it up, what started as a study of social skills has, for some, evolved into a set of manipulative tactics that can cause real damage in all kinds of relationships.
Right.
And the key takeaway for you, our listeners, is to stay informed. Pay attention to the dynamics in your relationships, trust your gut instincts, and don't be afraid to speak up or walk away if something doesn't feel right.
And on that note, here's something to ponder. How do you think the way romantic relationships are often portrayed in movies, TV shows, even social media might be contributing to the normalization of some of these manipulative behaviors? And what role do you think our own awareness and understanding plays in challenging those narratives and creating healthier, more respectful connections? Something to think about.
Lots to think about. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Thanks for having me. It's been a really interesting discussion.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe, and see you next time.